Welcome to Conversation with Iris, a podcast series on migration, diversity, and citizenship produced by a researcher at the Institute for Research into International Migration and Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. The podcast is available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Today, we have the great pleasure to host Professor Nandita Sharma from the University of Hawaiʻi. Her work examines the historical and political production of migration, borders, and national belonging, with a particular focus on the distinction between natives and migrants, which she explored in particular in her book, Home Rules, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Native and Migrants. Nandita, welcome to a Conversation with Iris.
Thank you, Nando. My pleasure.
So my first question is very much about the figure of the migrant, which has been very important in your work. And I was wondering if you can tell us, by reframing and problematizing this figure of the migrant, what enables us to see in the way that migration governance works, but also about the politics of belonging more broadly?
Yeah, I think that the key thing that looking at the migrant as a figure rather than an actual being in the world is very important because it directs us to how people are migrantized rather than assuming that there are just simply migrants in the world. And when we understand that people become migrantized, then we're able to more clearly focus on the social processes that make people into migrants. And that will eventually, hopefully, allow us to undo the divisions that states create through their categorical placement of people in hierarchical positions in society.
Are there specific groups or communities that could be work better as a way of seeing these tensions in this figure, this process of migrantization? So, for example, racialized communities, ethnic minorities. Is there your work? Have you focused on some groups in particular?
I haven't focused on particular groups other than, for example, I did considerable work on temporary foreign worker programs. And that studying the category of temporary migrant is really useful because what we learn is that it's the category itself that makes people precarious in national labor markets. It's not anything about them. You know, we're very used to talking about people as cheap labor. I'm more interested in how people are made to be cheap. And one of the key mechanisms that allows that to occur is the category of migrant, particularly temporary migrant versus permanent, resident, et cetera. All of those categories are mechanisms for nation states to manipulate their labor markets. The labor markets in which people are made available to employers in nation states can be manipulated by giving some people in certain categories more or less rights than others.
I think this is something that people often forget. You know, we look at migrants as a separate category, but also migration policy and migration governance as if it's not linked to other forms of governance, in particular of the labor market. And I think this work is extremely timely because at the moment we've seen, at least in the last 5 years, the number of countries that are increasingly using temporary forms of visa to govern the access to the labor market. So it seems like actually is a trend, and it would be really interesting to understand what's going on at the moment. So that we are moving away from an aspiration to permanent residency as part of the migration journey towards accepting that people come on short terms and then they leave.
No, absolutely. There is, I think, an attack on rights, right? And one of the major ways that states can engage in those attacks without very little political attention is through the category of migrant, right? Like shift them away from permanent residency towards temporary or even quote unquote illegal statuses. So in the United States, for instance, the largest category of migrants are those who are denied any status at all, right? Undocumented people, which is again itself a state category with enormous consequences for people's lives.
Sometimes I found interesting to explain to people that sometimes people don't move. They have been in the country for a number of years. It's the goalpost around them, the boundaries, they are reshaped continuously. I mean, in Europe, the Brexit has provided a very interesting case of this, like how European national in UK and British national in the European Union suddenly, as a result of Brexit, are reconfigured as a different category. They are migrantized. They're no longer EU citizens, but they are migrants. And in a sense, it's actually important, this idea of looking at the moment we are in and understanding it.
Right.
This, in a way, reminds me of, or take me to my second question, which is more about, you look at the binary between the migrant and the native, and you locate it in a specific historical moment. Could you explain a bit more this relationship between nation building projects and this binary?
Right. It's a bit of a complicated argument, so I hope that it makes sense, my more shorter explanation. But basically what I started with was the contemporary discourse that migrants are invaders, that migrants are colonizers, that migrants are quote unquote settler colonists. And I was like, how on earth did we get to this point where we're calling migrants colonizers? And what I had to do to understand how that came to be was understand how migrants were created in the first place and how they were separated from people who were classified as native. And of course, native is a category of imperial states, right? The people that they colonized were natives of whatever colony they're, referring to. So both of my parents, for example, were the natives of British India. That was the category into which they were born. When that category was constructed, the category of native, there were no immigration controls. Right. So everyone in British India, for example, was a native of British India, etc. The category of migrant came into being with the end of slavery. Right. Migration controls were a form of controlling people's mobility and therefore their labor and disciplining their labor after the end of slavery. So after the end of slavery, it became really important to distinguish between migrants and people who supposedly are not migrants, who are almost like in this existential way of the territory that they are found in, right? So I was really interested in how, in a world of nation states, the native has come roaring back into life and has become an important political category in nation states.
It seems almost the tension between the migrants as the uprooted and the native as the hyper-rooted. Hyper-rooted. I mean, this idea that there is some sense that the other of them represents some extreme of connection, either there's a weak connection or strong connection to a place where there is a middle ground, which is the one that decides the label.
Right, and it creates that's a really excellent way of putting it, right? The hyper-rooted versus the uprooted creates an imaginary of the world that we live in which each of us has some place that we belong. And when we're not in that place, we are not only do we not belong, we are colonizing those who apparently do belong, right? So it's this, and colonization is a very heavy term. To label someone a colonizer is to put that whole force of the violence of colonialism onto their backs, right? Like not only are you moving, but you are engaged in a process of violently disrupting or displacing those who truly belong. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be.
Another aspect which I found is fascinating, in a way, the rights of the native to exist are based on this fact of being connected to a specific piece of land. Right. And some of the work we are developing at IRIS here, actually also in Brazil, is about the tension between the indigenous right to a place in the context of climate change. So that in this sense, they only protect as long as far they stay where they are, and then otherwise they are unprotected. And the opposite with the migrant, in the sense that is they don't have right, or they just because they lose their land, in a sense. And it's really an interesting sort of way of observing perhaps the broader question around the citizen, who has the right to move and to stay without having somehow to find a justification for their existence.
Right. And it also points to the fact that this world cannot address people's needs with these categories that nation states impose upon us, right? Whether it's native or migrant or citizen, these don't actually work for us, right? They work for capital, they work for states, they work for nationalists who are interested in making exclusionary claims to rights, but they don't really work. And especially, as you pointed out, with climate catastrophe, any of us can be turned into a migrant with one flood or one fire. And then what do we do? Right? Why are we hanging on to categories that are not serving us?
And then bring immediately the question about who's responsible to protect or to give you in case of such a catastrophe. Is the nation state? Is a responsibility? It's quite interesting, this connection between the rule system and these events which somehow transcend the territory of the land. But you were mentioning very briefly before the problem with the colonialization and the power of the term. And some of your work is also around kind of a criticism of the decolonial narrative that's become so powerful in a way. Particularly, you related to the way that in some cases this decolonial narrative are appropriated for nationalist purpose. Can you tell us a bit more about this process?
Yeah. So again, referring back to my parents were born in the colony of British India. My grandparents were part of the liberation movement against British colonialism. And when I think of what they fought for, right, dignity, freedom, land, people in India didn't get any of that with the Indian nation state. In fact, things became worse for more and more people, right? The Indian nation state took more and more land from people. Their labor was exploited, right? India has the highest number of people living in abject poverty than anywhere else in the world. So when we equate decolonization with nation states, I think we're doing a great disservice to those anti-colonial struggles because people didn't achieve what anti-colonialism in that kind of national liberation form promised to them. And at the same time, each and every nation state, once they stopped becoming a colony and became independent, enacted immigration controls, right? So, for example, going back to India, what we see in India today is the attempt by the Indian government to define people out of Indian citizenship. So if you're Muslim or you're Christian or you're Sikh, you have to go through an extra effort to prove that you're an Indian citizen because they're trying to move as many people out of that category as possible and really narrow it even further. So when we equate decolonization with the achievement of national sovereignty, what we're both doing is ignoring what people actually mean when they want to be decolonized, which is more than becoming a national citizen. And we are also challenging this category of migrant that we started our conversation with, right? The category of migrant really becomes institutionalized when that imperial world falls apart and we're left with a world of nation states.
In a way, it's also, I guess, it's important to understand how the construct to this migrant is very much shaped by geopolitical projects. What I mean is, obviously, empires strategically have moved people to break nationalist movement, to reorganize the empire, to govern it, to create an economy of scale. And then the national state did the same. It moved, but moved different people. So I think by looking at migration as a separate event or phenomenon, you miss this connection between, why you move people, why there is this push towards some categories. I think it's an important one to not lose track of.
Well, I think it goes back to that category of migrant. So human beings have been moving since there have been human beings, clearly, right? Human beings move, right? Mobility is life. But the migrant only came into being with immigration controls, right? So migration is not the same as mobility, right? Migration and the migrant is the person who is regulated and restricted in their mobility by states. That's when you become a migrant, right? If my mobility is not restricted in the state that I hold nationality and I'm not a migrant, right? The migrant is that person whose mobility into that state is limited, right? So I think that that's a kind of good place to start critiquing the category of migrant, like whose mobility is controlled and whose isn't. Yeah,
because I mean, just to conclude, in a way, in the European Union as a project, there is this very stark distinction between the migrants as what they call third country national and EU nationals who are free movers,
right?
Where the European Union police the use of the term migrants when referring to internal mobility. So in a way, there is almost an understanding and a way making evident this process you're talking about. Is escaping the frame as migrant is in a way also to saying these people are not migrants because they are part of this political project of Europeanization. While the others come from outside for working for us, and they are migrants, and so they can be constructed within hierarchies.
And that category of migrant works to make them super exploitable. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Nandita,
Thank you.
for joining us.
Thanks.
So Conversation with Iris is available on YouTube and all major podcast platform, and catch up on previous episodes and subscribe so you don't miss any future one. See you next time.